it is with a mixture of expectation and regret that I welcome you to the final installment of our inaugural Classics Lecture Series. The last 3 weeks have been a wonder-inducing and deeply rewarding journey through the conceptual habit of ancient sympathy. Sadly, our journey will come to an end tonight, at least until the book of these lectures. So please join me in welcoming Brooke Holmes for the last of her lectures, which is entitled Human and Non-Human Natures and the Question of Nature.
Thank you. Well, I can say too, it's with a mixture of pleasure and, I suppose, displeasure that I stand before you, having had this lecture series come to an end and my time in Chicago coming to an end. It's really been an amazing quarter and an amazing 10 weeks, and I've really benefited from all the stimulating conversations and opportunities to interact with people. So thank you so much for all of the hospitality and especially the intellectual hospitality. So the word phusis enters the Western tradition in the 10th book of the Odyssey. Odysseus and his men had come so close to Ithaca that they could see their fellow citizens tending the fires of home. But then Odysseus falls asleep and his companions inadvertently release the winds of Aeolus, and they're all cast back into a state of wandering. Eventually they end up on the island of Circe. So upon landing, Odysseus dispatches a reconnaissance mission, but only the leader, Eurylochus, returns. Armed with Eurylochus's report of his companion's disappearance, Odysseus sets off into the forest alone in the hope of rescuing them. So he's on the threshold of Circe's domain when he's interrupted by Hermes in the guise of a young man, solicitous of the hero's humanity and skeptical of his prophylactic prowess. "Are you coming to free your companions?" he asks. "I do not think that you yourself will have a homecoming. But come," Hermes says, "I will spare you." The antidote to Circe's magic is a plant that the gods call molu. Hermes proceeds to uproot the plant and to show Odysseus its phusis. Odysseus, for he's the narrator of the story, tells us that the plant was black at its root with a white flower. So let's be honest, no one really knows what this Homeric hapax phusis really means here. The fact that Odysseus describes what the plant looks like right after mentioning its phusis has led some readers to speculate that what's at stake here is simply the form or the appearance of the plant. But there's reason to think that when Odysseus says that Hermes showed him the nature of the plant, he is concealing as much as he is revealing to his audience. The darkness of Molu's root at the moment of its uprooting might just be another screen. Nature is an occult power here disclosed in private communication with the god. And indeed, the image of the plant's dark roots contrasting with its white blossom visible on the surface will resonate with later figurations of a nature that's wont to hide, to quote a famous fragment of Heraclitus. The suffix cis in phusis, at any rate, suggests a dynamic power, something like a process of growth, or at least a form that's realized in time. If phusis is dynamic, its showing forth will always be partial. Its truth will always be somewhere between change and persistence. The stories that have been told by moderns about ancient Greek nature have long circled these propositions. What has received less attention is the fact that phusis enters Greek literature by way of the plant. And if this is an accident, I would say it is a happy one. For throughout its history, phusis will be intimately bound up with vegetal life. This is most obviously true in the use of phusis to describe the cohesion of the plant in the Stoics, or the body's non-conscious plant life in Galen. But even the Indo-European root from which the verb phuomai is derived appears most frequently with plants. And what's more, vegetality will have its own relationship to hiddenness. In the pseudo-Aristotelian De Plantis, the nature of plants is said to be kekrumene, hidden, concealed. Some centuries later, Aquinas will write that the life in plants is occulta, hidden. There are no doubt many reasons for speaking of the secret life of plants, including their complicity with traditions of esoteric knowledge. In the primal scene between Hermes and Odysseus, the plant's secret is a reservoir of power to be exploited by mortals and immortals, working towards an aim that is external to the life of the plant itself, namely securing Odysseus's life in its humanness. But what about molu qua plant? Here we might speculate that the mystery of the plant has something to do with the power that it at once discloses and conceals, something like life in the 0 degree, in its flourishing at once simple and opaque. So one last Homeric observation. The plant that Hermes uproots is plucked from isolation in a world that's known only to the gods. It's put into circulation in another community, one where gods and humans meet as tricksters and combatants, but also as collaborators and as erotic partners. So Circe, the master of theriomorphizing magic, is the consummate hostess and lover. The plant is here an instrument of power. Its relational world is defined exclusively by its implication in a high-stakes game between Circe and Hermes and Odysseus. Elsewhere in Homer, too, plants emerge as supporting players in the lives of humans and gods. So the cedar, for example, that lines the innermost storage chamber of Priam's palace, the oak tree whose toppling will figure the death of a warrior, the blossoms that spring up to cushion the lovemaking of Hera and Zeus. The unfolding of plants and animals into a community dominated by anthropomorphic agents is, again, no great surprise. The seamlessness of cross-species relations, together with their convergence on the figure of the human, has long been emphasized in discussions of early Greek attitudes towards the natural world. Now, these discussions look forward to a rupture in the relationship of humans to nature that is influentially dated by Friedrich Schiller to the Hellenistic period or the late classical period, where it will be worked out in poetry, especially pastoral poetry. But there's another way forward in time past Homer via the so-called inquiry into nature in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. So here all natures, despite their raucous diversity, are referred to a unifying concept of physis. Natures here interact most vividly in the exchange of basic stuffs through the processes of generation and decay. The story that I want to tell today will strategically take for granted familiar aspects of the inquiry into nature in order to home in on a turn within that inquiry that gets going, I want to say, in the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE, namely the rise of a concept that I've been calling capital N or big N nature. And I've suggested that we can get a better sense of the turn to big N nature by thinking our way into the conceptual domain of ancient sympathy, sympatheia. Now, one reason I've said that we might look to sympathy in this period is lexical. It's telling that the term sympatheia only starts to appear in the later 4th century, when nature is itself becoming a trans-individual force. And it's telling, too, that sympathy very quickly established itself as a technical term in a wide range of discourses, from cosmology to medicine, learned magic to natural history. And so these developments suggest that sympathy had begun to do important work in the Hellenistic period in helping to formulate as well as to answer new problems across a range of domains that were reflecting on and making use of the concept of physis. So I've suggested we can get a better sense of sympathy's implication in the formation of these problems by thinking of it as what I've been calling a conceptual habit. And I've used that term in part to shift attention away from approaches that frame sympathy as an erstwhile fact that was eventually discredited or simply abandoned in an epistemic rupture a la Foucault or Kuhn. I've spoken of a conceptual habit, too, with the hope of capturing the spillage of sympathy across different doctrinal and disciplinary domains in antiquity. The sheer range of Latin translations, so consensus, contagio, cognatio, concordia, conjunctio, to name a handful, bears witness to the polymorphic plenitude of what the Greeks call sympatheia. But alongside this plenitude, I've also wanted to emphasize the way that sympathy encourages certain habits of thought. These habits aren't simply dynamic, but can vector out in different directions along what I've been describing as vertical and horizontal axes. So this vertical axis is what leads from parts up to an encompassing whole, sometimes conceived of as an organism. It leads from part-to-part relations to the organizing intelligence behind them. By contrast, the horizontal axis moves at ground level among the parts within a community, among the mice and the sea urchins and the worms. Through the prism of sympathy, these parts are defined by a capacity to affect and to be affected, and more specifically by a capacity to affect and to be affected by particular natures in particular ways. So these axes, horizontal and vertical, generate not just dynamism, but also tension between a top-down intelligence and the differential distribution of mind through natures, and indeed as natures in the plural. I've also pointed to the way that an individual nature's own mindfulness works together with an openness to the world, and indeed to its own various parts. The openness of the organism is necessary to life, but also magnifies vulnerability. And last week I pointed to another latent tension between non-conscious vegetal life and the conscious mind, each endowed with its own way of maintaining life, each subject to being affected. So one of my tasks today is going to be to suggest some ways in which these tensions help produce and are mediated by a concept of capital N, nature. So in connection with this, I want to argue that the efflorescence of sympathy can be read as a symptom of the clustering of interest in various areas of inquiry into what I want to refer to as the relation. And what I mean by this more specifically is the relation as a problem in understanding organic life as fundamentally interconnected. The problem of the relation has to do with how the cosmos works as an integrated whole, especially when it's thought of as an organism. The relation has to do with the interaction of natures, especially plants and animals in the sublunary world. And the relation has to do with individual complex organisms' work. And here I'm going to remind you of the long-lived Hippocratic or Hippocratic topos of the sympathetic body. That the problem of the relation unfolds on all of these levels is suggested by the very fact that sympathy is itself a feature of the macrocosm and the microcosm, the cosmos and the terrestrial domain. The task then is to see if we can try to connect some dots between the apparently scattered appearances of sympathy by approaching it through the question of relations between natures, relations within natures, and the relation between natures and capital N nature. So I've been speaking so far in terms that support a hypothesis about rupture and discontinuity in the post-classical response or elaboration of the inquiry into nature. And yet, of course, it's also true that many aspects of the problems I've just sketched out were established within the inquiry into nature and its offshoots. Even more radically, I began with Phusis in Homer because I wanted to open up more supple ways of thinking about how continuities live alongside ruptures. So however much we've come back to the Odyssey with the long history of a nature that loves to hide in our minds, it seems to me that already on Circe's island, Molu figures a mysterious, a dynamic, and a not strictly godlike power. So the question of continuity and discontinuity is not just about antiquity. It also has consequences for how we read the afterlife of sympathy and the idea of big N nature. Indeed, when it's come to the history of nature, rupture has played an important structuring role. This has become especially true in recent diagnoses in anthropology and science studies and eco-criticism and political theory of what the matter is with a concept of nature. These diagnoses often tell us that our nature is a product of the early modern period or the Romantics of the 18th century or the 19th century. So the ancients here fall under the rubric of the archaic and the pre-modern rather than the timeless and the classical. And in fact, sympathy would seem only to confirm the archaic strangeness of antiquity. But of course, things are not so easy. The way that nature, or capital N nature, comes to stabilize the tension of sympathy's two axes will have a durable appeal. It's durable in part because the problems at stake here are very tenacious. So how is it that apparently mindless life forms such as plants and animals in our own non-conscious bodies manage the work of life? What trans-individual principle can account for the complex and quasi-social relations that function between species and their fittedness to the environment? What's the relationship between non-conscious or instinctual forms of mind and the conscious, rational mind of a human being? In what terms do rocks and plants, animals and humans and gods come together to form a single community? So these questions have become especially urgent in the early decades of the 21st century. And I pursue them here conscious of this urgency, but as ancient questions. I don't presume that there's an unbroken line of continuity between Greco-Roman antiquity and the present, and indeed the best reminder of discontinuity is the strangeness of sympathy. But at the same time, I see the conceptual labor that's especially evident around sympathy as making crucial contributions to a concept of nature whose costs may have become too high. So from this perspective, the ancients come in for genealogical analysis in a Foucauldian vein. As I said in the first lecture, what attracts me is precisely the doubleness of sympathy, its complicity with Western notions of nature, as well as its utter unfamiliarity. This doubleness distinguishes sympathy from more recent genealogies of nature, as well as from anthropological forays into the ecology of others, to again borrow the title of a book by Philippe de Collat. It proposes sympathy as one way towards what I called, after Nietzsche, an untimely ecology. So the rest of this talk is intended as a few steps in this direction. I want to turn now first to take a closer look at how the relation emerges as a problem within the study of nature and the organism before looking more directly at sympathy, capital in nature, and briefly the place of human beings within a sympathetic cosmos. So let me start then with a relatively schematic and abbreviated account of the rise of the inquiry into nature. By the end of the 5th century BCE, traditional ways of thinking about the gods as causes had been largely eroded, at least within certain domains. The gods from within this perspective were no longer primarily social agents whose interactions with each other and with mortals provided the explanatory engine of the non-human world. The explanations of physical events given by a physicos, a physicist such as Anaximander, involved the largely unseen transformations of a basic stuff, which may have been referred to as physis. For the later pluralists, the perceptible world was referred to the combination of a couple or more basic stuffs, so air, water, earth, and fire for Empedocles, or atoms for Democritus and Leucippus. So this, of course, is the world that's mocked in Aristophanes' Clouds, where Socrates runs a thinkery devoted to natural inquiry, including the study of fleas and gnats. But Socrates famously rejects his youthful allegiance to the physikoi in Plato's Phaedo. So there he complains about the limitation of the materialist conceptions of mind that he'd read about in his youth, and he singles out Anaxagoras for special contempt. So he says that at the height of his puzzlement about the causes of the phenomenal world, he hears someone reading from a book by Anaxagoras that says it's mind that arranges and causes all things. But when Socrates buys the book for himself, he's terribly disappointed. Anaxagoras, he says, makes no use of intelligence, but instead relies on familiar causes like hot, cold, wet, and dry. So what Socrates wants is a philosophy where the reason why things are the way they are and behave as they do is given in terms of the good. And the paradigm here is established from a first personal perspective. So I wouldn't be sitting here in jail if it were up to my sinews and joints. Rather, I'm here because the Athenians have deemed it best to condemn me, and I deem it best to undergo whatever penalty they order. So Plato's Timaeus is often seen as a sustained effort to respond to the insufficiencies of pre-Socratic explanations of the cosmos and the life forms within it, including humans. The dialogue tells a likely story that describes a cosmos created as an ensouled animal by an all-knowing demiurge. The demiurge ensures, importantly, that the cosmos is organized by reason in the service of the good, thereby correcting Anaxagoras' mistake. By conceptualizing the cosmos in terms of organic unity, the Timaeus plays an indisputable role in the later history of cosmic sympathy. So its influence on the Stoics is widely recognized, and moreover, through its translation into Latin and together with Neoplatonist appropriations of sympathy, the dialogue helped ensure sympathy's Platonic pedigree in the Renaissance and early modern periods. In the Timaeus, mortal beings are fashioned in such a way so that they can pursue the highest end, the life of reason within the constraints of a body. Their tendency towards the good is given to them by their creators, the lesser gods acting on the orders of the demiurge. And these demiurgic agents are also responsible for the relations between species. So plants, for example, are created as food for human beings. And again, it's the demiurge who ensures that the parts are integrated into an animate, wise whole that is itself the best possible world. Now, in all of this story, physis is present, but it's vested with little creative or structural power. The standard clue for its demotion in the Timaeus is usually looked for in Laws 10, where physis and chance are the motors of a materialist cosmos lacking in order and mind. The problem with physis, with this materialist association with physis, is why, as Helen Lang writes in a forthcoming paper, in the Timaeus we can see that Plato is not so much doing physics as so much as offering an alternative to physics. Now, the marginalization of physis in Plato's cosmology is, of course, countered by its centrality in his student Aristotle. In Aristotle's hands, nature is powerfully wedded to the notion of what is best, largely, if not exclusively, in the local sense of what is best for an individual nature. So Aristotle, of course, makes it clear he's not the first to take up physis. He engages closely and critical with his predecessors. Where earlier thinkers went wrong, he argues, is in looking to the matter, the hule of a thing, to establish its nature, the reason why it is the way it is. Now, Aristotle's own view of nature is something like an internal principle of motion and change. And in physics, too, he argues that to understand the nature of a thing in this sense, we have to look to its form, its eidos, or its morphe. But we can't just look to form as an abstracted from matter. The philosopher of nature is not just a mathematician, as Plato might have suggested with his elemental triangles in the Timaeus. Rather, a nature has to be taken as both form in matter as in mattered form. And here, of course, is the basis of Aristotelian holomorphism. Now, even the basic elements, earth, water, fire, and air, have natures for Aristotle. But he's especially interested in living natures. Indeed, in his initial list of things that exist by nature, physae in Physics 2, he first names animals and their parts, then plants, and finally the elements. So it would be very hard to overstate the pervasiveness of biological thinking in Aristotle's corpus, and it would be equally hard to overstate the subtlety and the sophistication that Aristotle brings to the conceptualization of organic nature. What Aristotle does is to insist on the explanatory integrity of a nature understood as a form of being, or in the case of organisms, as a form of life that is for the good of the being or the organism. So nature, as he says in Physics 8, is the cause of order for everything. Aristotle thus blocks a move to reduce nature or form to the level of constituent material stuffs. At the same time, as is well known, he rejects the need for a demiurge in his cosmology. Now, it's true that there are places where demiurgic thinking seems to persist in Aristotle's conceptualization of natures, or rather conceptualization of how form or nature acts through matter. But nevertheless, in the terms that I've been using these past few weeks, there is a profound horizontality in the way that Aristotle understands nature. So they aren't referred up to an overarching mind whose own intelligence accounts for their quasi-mindful enactment of their proper end or life. As Sean Kelsey has recently argued, natures, quote, have a kind of authority over their movement. They are the proper subjects of their own movements. So in short, we might say Aristotle secures the category of a nature, and especially that of a living nature, an organism, on its own terms, and he endows it with a kind of autonomy. Now, the claim on autonomy gives a sense of life as inward turning. Indeed, in the words of Christopher Frey, organic unities in Aristotle function as islands, naturally isolated from their inanimate environments. And by this, Frey means to emphasize that an organism pursues its life in the face of the centrifugal pull of all the other material potentialities that it incorporates. Life, from this perspective, can be seen as laborious. Nevertheless, if life is labor, it's also a task in which the many parts of an organism share. Aristotle had much to say on the organism's functional unity, that is, a unity understood in terms of the parts of the organism that are all realizing the common end of life, or more specifically, the form of life proper to the organism. The unity of the organism is understood, too, in terms of the holomorphism of body and soul. Aristotle was committed then to the inherent complexity of the organism, yet that complexity was understood primarily not in terms of heterogeneity, but in terms of the functional orientation of the many parts towards a common end. And yet, of course, life cannot be pursued in isolation. Organic natures are enmeshed in one another as a condition of the activity of life. Aristotle, the biologist, knew this well. Nevertheless, for all that he attends to the relations between parts within an organism, and indeed for all that he inquires into how organisms interact with the outside world through nutrition and perception, he pays little attention to what can explain the relations between natures. Now, having made this generalization, which I'll stand by, I should note that the status of the relation is highly controversial in Aristotle, and I'm not going to do justice to the debate here. But I do want to address a couple aspects of that debate, starting with the fact that Aristotle appears to speak on a few occasions in terms that suggest what has been called global teleology. Now, the question here is whether Aristotle recognizes a cosmic whole that encompasses all natures and also exhibits its own nature with its own telos. So in Metaphysics Lambda, he appears to address the question directly. Now, this is number 3 on your handout. I'm not going to read the whole quote. So he writes at the beginning, we must consider also in which way the nature of the whole possesses the good and the best, whether as something separated and by itself or as its arrangement. So Aristotle goes on to explain how all parts, including fish and plants, share in the nature of a common whole, though not in the same way. And in such participation depends in part on the relation of one thing to another. So David Sedley, who's been most energetic in defending the claim of global teleology, has emphasized that the model of the whole here is not that of the organism as it is in Plato and as it will be, of course, for the Stoics. Rather, the whole here is a hierarchical structure like a household or an army, and these structures are in fact given natures and ends in Aristotle's Politics. So Sedley argues controversially that this global end has to be understood anthropocentrically, at least in the sublunary realm. The lower orders, then, as much as they have their own natures, exist in relation to the ends of human beings. I don't want to get into the merits or the drawbacks of Sedley's position here. Rather, I want to look at what even a strong global teleology grants, and indeed fails to grant, to the relation between natures. For one thing, unlike Plato, Aristotle doesn't envision the cosmos as an animal. And on the heavens, there's no sense that living beings share a common soul through which they participate in the life of the cosmic organism. And this is, of course, what one was led to expect from the metaphysics passage, where the relation between parts is instead given by the form of a non-organic complex whole, namely a socio-political arrangement that constitutes a partnership, koinonia, for the sake of a good. So it's in this way that nature would become trans-individual in Aristotle. And for another thing, even an anthropocentric teleology is not going to give a very robust sense of how an organic nature achieves its end in a fundamentally relational way. There's little, if any, interdependence between natures here. Rather, on this model, the lower order natures, animals and plants, forfeit their own ends to be instrumentalized within the lives of humans. Of course, this position is abhorrent to a number of Aristotelians, but that would be the consequence of Sedley's position. So whatever you think of this argument, it's a limited view of the relation, especially as the relation is understood as constitutive of non-human lives. Now, the situation will look very different if we turn to the Historia Animalium. For here we find abundant examples of how the lives of different non-human animals are entwined in ways that involve both cooperation and antagonism. So these are the friendships and the wars, the philiae and the polemoi that I spoke of a couple of weeks ago. And yet Aristotle offers no explanatory framework for making sense of these natural relations, which are so integral to an organism's pursuit of life. On a few occasions, he credits the intelligence of animals, but he doesn't at any rate refer the cross-species relation to a trans-individual principle nor to a nature of the whole, with one possible and again much discussed exception. So at one point in the history of animals, and this is number 4 on your handout, he observes that now the other fishes catch the smaller ones straight ahead in their mouths when in their natural swimming attitude. But the Selacians, that is sharks and dolphins and all cetaceans, turn over on their backs to take them, for their mouth is below. Hence the smaller fishes tend more to survive, otherwise it is thought there would be few altogether, for the dolphin's quickness and veracity seems to be astonishing, thamaste. So the passage gives the sense here of an ecological balance which is somehow secured through a feature in the nature of sharks and dolphins that's disadvantageous to their own survival, or at least to their own natures. The perceived conflict with mainstream Aristotelian teleology has led some to posit the passage as interpolated, Others point to a similar passage in Parts of Animals, which I've put in smaller print on the handout, where the specter of demiurgic nature remains, but is at least countered by reasoning that sets the sharks' mouths in the context of their own well-being, so they're not too gluttonous. Still, if the sharks are an exception here, they're an exception that would seem to prove the rule. For the most part, Hosapitopoulou, in his conceptualization of the organism, Aristotle is working at the level of a nature. And the sharks, and the example of the sharks, also suggests the problem of the relation. Namely, it points to a logic that exceeds the nature of a single organism. The explicit fear of modern commentators is if Aristotle were to pursue such a logic, he would lapse into what Baum calls a philosophy fiction, dominated by none other than a hypostasized nature. Roger French sees Theophrastus as headed in just this direction precisely because, in a critical reception of Aristotelian natural history that takes off from the plant, he looks to the interconnectedness of natures. So what we see by tracing out the debates in Aristotle's cosmology and biology is, I suggest, a potentiality that is not in fact actualized within Aristotle's corpus, namely the idea of the relation between natures as such. Aristotle documents at length cross-species relations, but he doesn't theorize them within the parameters of a nature. He doesn't work out the nature of the whole cosmos at any length, and when it is mentioned, it's figured not in organismic terms, but in terms of a socio-political arrangement. So here the sense of what Aristotle does not do, I think, is felt especially strongly given the looming presence of the Timaeus and its strong sense of cosmic order under the aegis of the demiurge and the world animal with the world soul. So where the question of the relation is especially important would seem to be within a nature. So Aristotle clearly thought deeply about the part-to-whole relationship at the level of the organism, and he developed influential resources for thinking the heterogeneity of the organism in terms of functional unity and bringing body and soul together as an inseparable compound. But nevertheless, in a sense, the organism is an island. My point in all of this is not to advocate for what Aristotle should have done, nor even to suggest he would have the resources to answer these questions. Rather, I simply want to suggest that the relation between natures is a question that's left newly open by the Aristotelian project, and with it, the question of what happens to organic unity when enmeshment is prioritized. So whether or not you accept this, it's enough to simply recognize that questions of the relation between and within natures becomes increasingly visible in cosmology and natural history, in psychology and physiology, as we enter the Hellenistic and imperial periods, as we have over the last 3 weeks. So one of, if not the crucial connection between these nodes of visibility is nothing other than sympathy. Sympathy is, we might say, a symptom of growing interest in the relation. More specifically, I want to argue that sympathy indexes an approach to the relation that looks to the nature's capacity to be affected by another nature. So what will matter here is not the participation in a cosmos by virtue of mathematical ratios, as in a notion, say, of symphonia, nor is a nature affected simply as a body participating in a material continuum, so that would be atomism. Rather, what matters is the capacity to be affected qua nature, that is, through the form of one's own being. To test this claim, I want to go back to some of the sites where I've just located the problem of the relation in Plato and also in Aristotle. So first, we meet the question of how individual beings or natures are incorporated into a larger cosmic whole. So Theophrastus seems to have reverted back to the idea of an animate cosmos, and he writes in his Metaphysics that the parts are symphonious with one another. But it's, of course, in the Stoics that the idea of organic unity of the cosmos is taken to an extreme, both in the thinking of organicism, as I argued, and both in the thinking of unity. And of course, one of the privileged signs of this unity is cosmic sympathy. In my first lecture, I argued that with sympathy we find on the one hand the work of the active principle through which the participation of parts in the whole is secured. The Stoics were unabashedly anthropocentric and deterministic, and that affects how the active principle plays out. But the participation that I'm talking about here also looks more to the enmeshment of various living beings in a trans-individual principle in the context of their own lives. So the shellfish whose lives pulse together with the waxing and the waning of the moon, the trees whose flourishing is wedded to the change of seasons. So these natures pursue life in sympathetic concert with other natures and with the whole. And if we then were to ask further how sublunary natures pursue life in relation to one another, we arrive at a second way of thinking the relation, namely the friendships and the wars of the Historia Animalium. These relations, too, loom large in Stoicism. In the Stoics, natural history comes center stage in order to demonstrate the overarching providence of nature, and they also draw on natural history in order to show the organization of individual natures in terms of the recognition of benefit and harm. Now, in the Stoics, we don't actually see the conceptualization of these relations thought through the terms sympathy and antipathy. And as I said the first week, I think this is because they have a strong notion of solo sympathy, and within that context, sympathies and antipathies would sort of muddy the water. But if we were to turn to natural history proper, we would see that these friendships and wars were regularly called, as Pliny points out at the beginning of Book 20 of his Natural History, sympathies and antipathies. This is, he says, what the Greeks call sympathies and antipathies. So finally, there's the question of how parts within an organism relate to one another and the whole. And here again, we find the language of sympathy cropping up, sometimes in the context of shared vulnerability, sometimes to capture the coordination of parts towards a common end. These parts can be multiple and integrated into the body's non-conscious vegetal activity of life, and the parts might be body and soul, which share in each other's affections, but also share the vital work of perception and locomotion through a relation often described in the Hellenistic period as sympathy. And of course, for the Stoics, the integrity of any cohesive body, including stones, will be understood in terms of sympathy. So by following the thread of sympathy, we find ourselves at the major sites for thinking the relation within an organism and between organisms in the post-classical period. I want to argue further now that it is just at these sites that we can glimpse the emergence of a concept of trans-individual, or capital N or big N, nature. So let's start here this time with the domain of sympathies and antipathies. So a couple weeks ago, I suggested on the basis of a reading of Pliny that the difficulty of making sense of these quasi-social relations between animals and plants encouraged a move upwards towards a trans-individual principle of nature. One reason for this is that there aren't resources within the concept of at least a non-human nature to explain the relation. So non-human natures aren't endowed with enough mind on a post-Aristotelian scala naturae to forge their own relations. So as an alternative, you could actually drill down to the level of constituent stuffs in order to try to account for these loves and hates. But to deny sympathy through reductionism would be, as we can see, the mark of an atomist. It's not a mark you want to bear for our sympathy advocates. So indeed, to recall that in On the Natural Faculties, Galen makes the denial of sympathy, this is passage 5 on your handout, one of the marks of the corpuscular theorists who fail to put nature first and foremost. Asclepiades denies that there's any sympathy within the world. In the 6th book of On the Nature of Things, we can see Lucretius working out atomist accounts of phenomena that by his day had undoubtedly become paradigms of sympathy and antipathy. So the magnet here is a major explanandum. But Lucretius lists too, and this is number 6 on your handout, the goat's love of wild olive, which is impossibly bitter to humans, and the pig's abhorrence of marjoram oil. He will go on to explain all of these apparent sympathies and antipathies in terms of the different pores that make up different natures. And the idea of different pores may very well go back to Democritus. But I suggest that some of the care that Lucretius takes here, and also in Book 4, to unveil the exchange of simulacra among different natures below the threshold of perception, had as its purpose the denial of sympathy and antipathy. For in the intellectual context of Lucretius, sympathy and antipathy presumably would have pointed to a transcendent principle of nature. So the Epicureans' mortal enemies, the Stoics, had no such qualms about big N nature, which was one of the many names of the active principle diffused throughout the entire cosmos. They didn't hesitate to explain the sympathies and antipathies between different animals in terms of a providential hypostasized nature, as we can see in Book 2 of Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods and on other sources on oikeiosis. In one of the best-known Stoic definitions of nature, and here we're looking at handout 7, it's expressly endowed with technical power. It is, as Diogenes Laertius reports, a craftsman-like fire, pour technikon, proceeding methodically to genesis, a fiery and techne-like breath. And nature also comes into play at the level of cosmic sympathy. It's in large part because this demiurgic nature is not just immanent but transcendent that it can account for the relations between things and between part and whole. So in another definition of phusis that's given by Diogenes, phusis is what makes the whole cosmos cohere. And remember that in Stoicism, cohesion is not just gluing things together, but this very strong internal unity. So it's worth citing again a passage from Cleomenes that we saw a few weeks ago, and this is number 8 on the handout. Cleomenes here argues that it's evident that nature controls the cosmos from the ordering of the parts within it and the sympathies of these parts. Nature's hegemony is evident too from the fact that all parts are made in relation to something, pros te. So even critics of the Stoics had recourse to nature when they were faced with cosmic sympathy. Both Cotta in On the Nature of Gods and Cicero in On Divination credit the coordination of trees and oysters and the moon to nature or to the powers of nature. In a narrower sense, phusis for the Stoics designated the cohesion of a plant, defined against the hexis of the stone and the soul of the animal. In Diogenes, it's what makes terrestrial things spring to life. That's another definition of phusis, or how it's used. The intimacy between phusis and vegetality, as I said at the beginning of the talk, is long-lived. Here, I think it's possible to see vegetal life as somehow capturing the immanent mindfulness within ostensibly mindless non-human bodies that had already been associated with nature in Aristotle. But the question is, what happens when the mindfulness of a nature, especially a non-human nature, is opened out into a larger web and thus put on a continuum with the mind of God? The concept of a trans-individual creative nature, I think, is especially useful here for creating a bridge between the mind of God and the mindless but vital being that's emblematized by a plant. Capital N nature, in other words, contains within itself a scala. It therefore enables horizontality and verticality. The pressures of capital N nature may seem less powerful when it comes to the organization of parts within an organism. And yet here, too, I would argue that interest in the relation alongside the emergence of a trans-individual agential nature invites reflections on how an organism pursues its own life within a larger web. And Galen, as we've seen, is a particularly rich resource in this regard. His philosophy of nature is organized by a Janus-faced commitment to the Platonic demiurge on the one hand and Aristotelian teleology on the other. It comes as no surprise then that Big N nature does considerable work in his account of complex organisms together with a concept of sympathy. So on the one hand, nature, capital N, becomes a nature, phusis tis, he says at one point, engaged in the vegetal labor of life through the work of the natural faculties. These faculties facilitate the organism's navigation of what is proper or kin and what is hostile, and then later he'll substitute aesthesis as what actually controls these relations. On the other hand, Galen puzzled to the end of his life about what we mean when we say nature. Everyone talks about nature, as he says, in the formation of the fetus, but no one knows its substance, its ousia. We see only the white blossom, we might say, and never the dark root. Galen worried not just about the relation of nature to demiurgic nature, but also about the relation of soul to body and the relation of vegetal life to rational life. And in these moments when nature itself becomes riven, we see that sympathy recedes as a sign of unity and community. That nature is the name of a community that nevertheless might be internally divided is the possibility and the problem that I've been tracking along the vertical and horizontal axes of sympathy. So one way of thinking the doubleness or the dividedness of nature looks to the relationship of nature to a nature. So on the one hand, we can emphasize the agential mind of an external nature. On the other hand, we can emphasize the capacities of an organism to perpetuate its own life by navigating its relation to other natures as friendly or hostile. Another way of thinking the doubleness of nature recognizes the top-down, inward-turning work of a nature, but also its affectability. So the organism's necessary embeddedness in a dynamic web opens it to harm as much as to benefit. The entwining of mind or soul with body allows affections to travel in both directions. The complexity of an organism is also its heterogeneity and its possible fragmentation. These tensions, complexities, and problems have consequences for human natures, as we began to see last week in Galen. And it would be the work of another series entirely to map these adequately. So let me then just in closing outline two ways in which we see human beings being integrated into non-human communities organized by sympathy and sometimes antipathy. So first, from the Timaeus, and indeed from points earlier, the enthusiasm for defining human nature in terms of reason is matched by a desire to embed mind and reason within the cosmos as a whole. It's a distinctive mark of Greco-Roman philosophy that it doesn't really have an is-ought problem in the matter of the naturalistic fallacy. For the dominant strand of philosophy that's most associated with Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, moral goodness is a feature of the world. This is not least because the cosmos is seen as necessarily superior to any single organism within it, including humans. Now, it may not be easy for us to perfectly align our lives in perfect harmony with this goodness. The Stoic sage, for example, is as rare as the phoenix. But ancient philosophers commonly end up arguing that our truest nature is to participate in cosmic reason through our own capacities for thought. In the Timaeus, for example, it's possible to align the circles of the soul within the chaotic flux of matter by observing the circular rotation of the heavens. In the Stoics, this came to be called living in agreement with nature, sometimes called following nature. And the sage isn't just living in perfect harmony with the cosmos taken as a whole. He lives together with the community of all sages, wherever they are in space and time. As Plutarch puts it, and this is number 9 on the handout, if a single sage anywhere extends his finger prudently, all the sages throughout the world will benefit. This is the work of their friendship, into which the virtues of the sages for their common benefit end. So herein lies the essence of what is called Stoic cosmopolitanism, which is another expression of sympatheia. And yet our embeddedness in a sympathetic cosmos is not only one of mystical participation or union achieved at the highest level of our being. We are also terrestrial beings sharing a world with plants and animals and stones. So what makes our entanglement in the sublunary world a problem is our constitutive blindness to our place in this community. So like Odysseus on Circe's island, we're blind to the means of our survival. From the beginnings of naturalizing anthropologies in antiquity, we find a fixation on the idea that humans are unlike non-human animals and plants in their lack of fit with their environment, something I've called elsewhere negative exceptionalism. So one classic text here is the Hippocratic On Ancient Medicine, where techne first arises because human nature is too weak to assimilate the nature outside in the world. The first innovation is cooking, followed by the medical art. If we fast forward to Pliny, we find that the trope of nature becomes that of nature as a cruel stepmother. As Pliny has occasion to observe time and again, humans are the only animals who fail to grasp the means of their lives, and this is number 10 on the handout. So Pliny offers his own sprawling encyclopedia, or at least the longest didactic stretch on materia medica, as the solution. The text is designed as a guide to pursuing life consciously in the absence of the intuitions about benefit and harm that come naturally to other animals. And so without this guide, life itself is at risk. So to be blindly plugged into a network of sympathies and antipathies can cast embeddedness in a very dystopian light. We're here at an early moment of what Tim Morton has called dark ecology. So even Galen, strident champion of untaught nature that he is, recognized the limits of nature's power to guide us. He comes close to trying to create a continuum between the sympathies and the antipathies of the organs and our more conscious actions on the natural faculties. The stomach, for example, longs after and tends towards what is advantageous and proper to it, and loathes and rids itself as what is foreign. So Galen reports, and let's see, I think this is this one here, that the stomach sometimes even grabs the food that it deems appropriate right out of the mouth without the person even wanting to swallow. So in other words, the stomach can sometimes override intentional agency. But of course, most of the time, the stomach doesn't act like a hand. It's precisely because the conscious mind mediates the relationship between the vegetal body and its environment that there's a need for techne. Galen was, after all, a physician, and he was well acquainted with the malfunctioning of the organism. I've just sketched two different scenarios of human embeddedness in a non-human web of sympathies and sometimes antipathies that have been drawn from the texts I've been working with over the last 3 weeks. They converge insofar as they imagine reason as that which puts us in relation with a larger non-human world. Reason leads to mystical union with the mind of God. It enables us to control our relations with the plants and animals around us. These scenarios converge too in making reason the ideal fold, as I've called it, between capital N nature and human nature. So in medicine, reason turns the interface between human nature and non-human nature surrounding it into a locus of conscious, learned control. And in philosophical ethics, reason or mind is often allied with the autonomy of a self-mover. So even for determinists like the Stoics, reason will give you the option of trotting behind the cart of fate rather than being dragged along like a recalcitrant dog. The priority of reason and technical knowledge might have been predicted by the scene that we began with, where Odysseus wards off the threat of becoming animal by being instructed in the physis of a plant. Indeed, in Neoplatonist allegorical readings, Hermes will be read as the symbol of logos. And reason's privilege will, of course, be familiar to anyone acquainted with the history of ancient philosophy and science. I should say that there are other routes open to us for thinking about the relationship of humans to non-humans in ancient texts. So I have not even touched on poetry here or the pastoral fantasy, and nor have I pursued ancient attempts to think the relation with animals in particular in terms of the contract or in terms of justice. But the centrality of reason is important for reasons that I want to emphasize, namely that there's a tendency within sympathy, qua conceptual habit, at least within discourses of physis, the discourses I've been looking at, towards isolating reason and reason alone as the bridge that bridges between humans and non-humans. And to see the world as ordered by transcendent mind is more often than not to encourage forms of anthropocentrism. At the same time, the focus on a robust community of non-human organic natures will often end up emphasizing the technicity of human natures in ways that bear critical examination. But my primary aim here has not been to provide a cautionary reading of the Greco-Roman legacy, nor has it been to advocate for the ancients as somehow voices of wisdom, for thinking about sympathy as somehow a wonderful community of human and non-human in an age of environmentalism. Rather, the work that I've been undertaking here, exploratory and partial, lies further upstream. There's still much to figure out about how the inquiry into nature in antiquity comes to take up the question of the relation, to figure out where that inquiry becomes, we might say, ecological. Now, the word ecology is, of course, an ancient-sounding modern word that was coined in the 19th century. But I don't believe that taken as a conceptual problem, rather than a science or as an academic discipline, ecology is a hopeless anachronism. Indeed, the word ecological captures something important about what happens to ancient inquiries into nature in the Hellenistic period. The efflorescence of sympathy is a symptom not of decline or of mysticism, but of the need to think the organism through the figure of the relation. I've suggested that these practices of thought around sympathy help generate, develop, and sustain a concept of capital N nature. And before we know whether they are productive or damaging, we need to better understand them. Then again, I want to suggest that part of the task of an untimely ecology is precisely to dwell in the complexity of ancient sympatheia. The domains that I've tried to map are dynamic and they're messy. They're structured by problems that shouldn't be resolved too quickly to produce univocity. There's an invitation, I think, in an inquiry of this kind to try to think not so much contradiction as complexity, so the organism as both open and closed, nature as both beings in themselves and parts of larger wholes, human lives that unfold consciously and unconsciously. And indeed, this is what makes an inquiry of this kind more than historical, I would say. For by returning to the emergence of nature qua trans-individual principle, we can, I think, find ways to interrogate its work today. To interrogate two modes of relationality with the non-human that are predicated only on techne and the commitment to a rationality that is exclusively and categorically human. The challenge here is to think organisms as vulnerable or open and as also telic and organized. It's to take on board ancient philosophy's ideal of arete, that is, a flourishing, not as prescriptive and not as pious and not as radiocentric to the exclusion of embodied life, but rather to see it as a call to rethink modes of mindfulness and reflexivity and care that persist despite fragmentation, that thrive in contingency, and that are lived through relationality. And it is the challenge to imagine a mode of thinking in relation to antiquity that is at once constrained and made generative by difference. The rallying cry of ancient physics was that nothing comes from nothing. We might translate for a new physics, no future without a past. Thank you.
About this openness of natures to one another, and to dwell a little bit longer on how this plays out in Aristotle. In particular, the notion of his natures as islands,
yeah,
where you drew from Chris Sprague's work. So there's a way in which life, as it's conceptualized there, is really vegetal life. But there's a kind of...
by there you mean in Frey or in Aristotle?
In Frey.
Right.
Good. It's the kind of organization that resists the environment in a certain way by maintaining its own form.
Yeah.
And from that point of view, what organizes living natures is going to be this kind of island-like quality, this internal organization, this resistance to the outside. But as we move from the kind of soul that characterizes all life to animal soul and maybe even rational soul, a new possibility for openness comes into view. And in particular, I want to focus on perception because you made some suggestive remarks about reason at the end. But in perception, which we share with animals, which we have qua animal, it's striking that the activity of perception, of my perceiving, is the same as the activity of something that is being perceived, objects in the world that are external to me, whether they're natures or not. And this kind of openness is not just a matter of the form of an organism resisting, although there might be ultimately nutritive or reproductive ends to the activity of perception.
Right.
In perception, there's a kind of sympathy, right? As Aristotle argues, there's a kind of joint activity and an assimilation that doesn't simply involve, as in nutrition, reducing the external thing to myself.
Yeah, and that's an important point, yeah.
Yeah, and I was thinking a little bit about perception of the Stoics too, and just one last suggestive observation, that they say, there's a report in, I think, Saxus Empiricus, that they claimed that perceptual impressions are technikon in a certain way, which is just the word that they use for nature too.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be interesting if nature organized in such a way that would allow for these kinds of activations? And maybe
I think that's I actually think that's totally right, but yeah.
Yeah, so maybe it's not in view in Aristotle yet, but there's at least something there. There's kind of another kind of openness that's possible, even from within his conception of life. And it's not quite simply, nature as island to nature as harmonious.
Yeah. No, thank you. And I mean, and that's exactly, I think, an important thing to bring out, because for my purposes, obviously, what I'm trying to show is not that there's nothing. And in a way, I want to show that there are all of these suggestions, all of these possibilities, all of these places where the space for relation is opened up, but that it's not consistently actualized. And I think looking at the way Theophrastus begins to think about the interconnectivity between natures and what he doesn't call but later get called sympathies and antipathies, just sort of shows against the foil of the Historia Animalium how much those interrelations are not theorized and they're not sort of brought to the surface. They're not taken up as as relations that need to sort of change how you conceptualize the notion of a nature. So I take your point that about this idea that it's really vegetal life that's being pushed, sort of inward turning, but that vegetal stratum persists at every level, all the way to the rational. But I mean, the other point, so there's two more things I would say, because I think one of the things that's also interesting about Aristotle is that when you get to the level of humans, of course, there is a space for relations. There's a space for Suzanne, for living together in the political world. And one of the things I think that's opening up with Sympathy is how can we imagine the polis beyond the boundaries of the polis? How can we imagine a notion of a political, a socio-political community, an organismic community, whatever it is, that includes non-humans not just as instruments and not just as potential social agents in the way that we're social agents, but really as natures in the way they've been conceptualized in Aristotle. I mean, that's the work that Aristotle is doing, is to insist on the integrity of the nature. To do that, he doesn't quite put it in relation. And the other thing I would say is, I mean, I think perception, and that's why I get so excited about the fact that in Galen he comes to the conclusion that plants need perception too. That in fact that it's not a higher form of life that has to somehow engage with the environment in that way, but any form of life is just being able to recognize kin and non-kin and to be responsive in ways that are not just mechanistic. And that is, to me, a kind of way of thinking forward of how to get past this idea of reason or mind as what sets humans off from non-humans, that we can never think the two together on a continuum. The areas where you're seeing, say, work on semiosis and sign making as a continuum between human life and animal life and plant life, in the work of Eduardo Kohn, for example, in his How Forests Think, or all this amazing work that's being done on plants, incredibly controversial, that people say, plants don't have minds, this is crazy. No, because precisely they have this semiotic perceptual activity. So I'm not against it all going back to Aristotle and saying the resources are there, but my work here was really to say they're not actualized, but it's not just us who will actualize them. I think we have to recognize, to go back and think how they were actualized in antiquity. But I think a lot of going back to Aristotle is like Aristotle here in his thing of the organism and now. And we don't recognize there's a whole rich area of thinking the relation already in antiquity.
I wanted to ask you this idea of the way sympathy fits in with sort of broadly political metaphors. I was really interested in that. And wondering if you think that it's important, or maybe not, to distinguish between household communities and properly political communities. I'm thinking about in Republic when he talks about what, in retrospect, when you think of as sympathy, that the goal of getting rid of family life is so that the guardians can all be one big family, so that they can feel the pain. He uses the finger analogy, and as one. And then I was just sort of struck in looking at the Aristotle passage that you mentioned, where your response to Baum, I think it was suggesting, well, look, Aristotle could have gone in a political direction, that the polis is sort of autonomous individuals who nevertheless somehow cooperate together. But in fact, Aristotle doesn't talk about a polis. He talks again about a household. There's his image there. And so that just sort of struck me. I was surprised just to really focus in on that. And then you drew the connection to Stoic cosmopolitanism. But it makes me wonder whether, should we treat those all the same, or is sympathy a particularly household form of kinship?
Yeah. I think it's an amazing question, because you're absolutely right. In that Aristotle passage, the kind of shift from thinking the political to the oikos, and is it in part because the notion of hierarchy becomes so important to thinking? I mean, and that would kind of play into Sedley's argument that what this is all about really is a kind of instrumentalizing global teleology. But I don't know if that's the only conclusion you would have to draw from that. I mean, I think there's more to it. And I began to think about this a little bit when I was like, ecology, and it's coming, so what is the space? Because I've been talking about a kind of political, because of that Aristotelian moment and this notion of the organism and how does the oikos come into being. And I think to answer that question, it would be to really think of what the status is of the notion of oikeon. And that is the notion of what is kin. And the cue that the oikos is actually really important is that much of what I was doing, a kind of breakthrough for me with working on this project was to say, it's not just the language of sympathy and antipathy. As much as, it's a lexical issue, so I'm looking for that. I'm looking for where these friendships and hatred, whatever get cashed out in terms of sympathy and antipathy. But in a lot of other places, it's precisely in terms of what's oikeo and what's allotrion. Those are the terms in which the Stoics are working, in which Galen is working, that get mapped onto this notion of sympathy as being able to navigate relations. And so that notion of kin is really important. And the other thing that I sort of need to think more about, but is important to this, is that so one thing that I think Aristotle, this is just a hypothesis that I haven't worked out, but like, why is he not so interested in the question of relations between natures? He really doesn't like the idea of like to like and unlike, contrary. I mean, he has his uses for it, but like, it's a limited explanatory principle, I think, for him. And there's a way in which what's oikeo and what's allotrion is a more subtle understanding of that, but is embedded in that tradition. And so I wonder if there's something there that prevents him from sort of going in that direction. But somehow that would be to say that to move past whatever limitations there are in this explanatory principle, like to like, unlike to, which is so important in the Presocratics, is to sort of start thinking about, again, what's oikeon. What's kin? And kin is a way, that can both be a friend and can be food. I mean, that goes back to, what level are we at? And that's, that's symbiosis. That's the complexity of symbiosis. So thanks. I mean, I have to think more about it.
So it's actually probably all my questions always come out of left field, but maybe particularly so today because I haven't been present for all the lectures. But I was so picking up on Gabriel's comment, I would have another question like the one I did 2 weeks ago about divergence between Latin and Greek tradition, but also I'd be curious about the sort of limits, since you sort of closed by talking about the political, about the limits of these sort of both as it were metaphorical, but also theoretical moves between the natural and the political. Mm-hmm. And the reason I thought about this is because in a particular tradition in the study of the West, there's people writing about the history of religion or the history of religious thought frequently posit a break between some moment in Roman antiquity and some moment in Christian antiquity when there's a sort of profound break between concepts of nature. So that, for instance, in there are several moments in Roman legal texts where a contrast is made out natura out lege, they would say. And when they say the contrast is not between some natural world and a human world that is ruled by laws, but rather between how humans go about their lives in everyday existence, and then the sort of epistemologies and formalities that are necessary in law. So the issue in one of the key moments is, let's say somebody's convicted of a crime, but he was actually innocent. Is he guilty aut natura aut lege? So as it were, is he guilty in real, actual lived reality, or is he guilty only because the law says he's guilty?
Right.
That's, for instance, one of the contrasts, and that's one of the uses of natura that's quite common mm-hmm. in high imperial legal sources. And many people would say that sort of, a later moment, say when Christians become really worried about what happens to the body, and the body as natural created artifact, is something that's inconceivable within this earlier specifically Latinate tradition. So Augustine worries endlessly about the rotting body and where do the maggots come from. Mm-hmm. There's a sort of worry, and in the end he doesn't really want to say it's because the body is, well, you kept using the word vegetal, but he would say he's not really entirely sure he wants to call it, flesh, the body is flesh for him largely as a metaphor. When he actually confronts the fleshliness of the flesh, or the worldliness of the flesh, he gets really upset. So when he says maggots appear in bodies after they die, he says it's quasi-seminaliter. It's like there's seeds of maggots in you all the time, but it's really, that kind of gross. So it's just quasi, and it's seminaliter. So right, there's the adverb, and the adverb itself is qualified, and blah, blah, blah.
And that wouldn't be the vegetal body, but yeah.
But he doesn't really want to say that, right? Which is why he hedges in all these various ways. So I was I was curious, either whether you want to talk about, right, because again, natura and physis have rather different associations, and this was a very Greek talk, except for the one little bit of Pliny. I'd be curious to know whether you think whether you could write a similar story on the Latin side of things, whether the same metaphors about the natural as political in the way that you're charting them out at various moments in your talk, whether with regard to the household is natural but also a political entity, or whether the polis comes in, and or whether you want to talk about whether there's some sort of 3rd, 4th century moment when this kind of talk becomes impossible, in part because in the Latin tradition, the causal explanation people is given is that when there, as it were, is a consensus view that nature is divinely created, an earlier Roman law, this distinction between lege and natura becomes simply, lex and natura becomes simply impossible. And so that
once you're outside this Roman tradition and you're inside a fully Christian legal tradition where there's,
so there's a sort of Latin narrative, and there's a transitional moment in the Latin narrative, and I'm interested in whether any bit of that, right, whether there are homologies or discontinuities with the kind of story you're telling on the Greek side. Also, by way of inviting you to think about the limits of this apparatus, nature, oikos, nature.
I mean, so do you, just one kind of question back to you before I answer. I mean, the distinction between physis and nomos as it's used in the 5th century is seen as totally discontinuous with what you're talking about in Roman legal thinking. Where again, like what's, physae is what really what's actually the case versus what's just custom or convention.
Yeah, I don't think, the nomos physis distinction gets every now and then cited, both by the Romans themselves and by others writing about Rome, essentially as having been entertained by Romans as a possible theoretical distinction. Essentially, in the age of Cicero, it's abandoned. Right? There are a couple of other, like unwritten law. In fact, the concept of unwritten law as it emerges from Greek into Latin is so foreign to the way the Romans think that every now and then in Roman texts, in fact, even in medieval copies of Roman texts, it's still written in Greek letters because it's like marked out as this sort of weirdo Greek concept.
Yeah.
And I think the nomos physis distinction is another one of these that they know it exists, they sort of know how to play with it, but they're not sure that it maps any of the sort of distinctions that are fundamental to the way they think about the relationship between.
Right. I mean, okay, and I can see that. I mean, there's a kind of big gap between the context and time and all the rest. But that's not, so that's interesting. But to go back to, so 2 responses. I mean, first of all, I don't think the talk of the political is a metaphor. Like, I think that what the question is actually a kind of moment of thinking both the polis within a larger discourse of physis and also trying to think about whether that concept can be extended to a world that doesn't involve humans. And so they don't have the capacity for language, they don't have the capacity to teach one another, and yet there are these friendships and wars, and so how is that made possible? How are these allegiances, how are these kinships, as it were, sort of made possible? And so it's the kind of persistence of the political model into that larger realm that I think starts to push up, as I said, to this kind of big N notion of nature as a kind of, not a philosopher king, but as a figure that, as it were, kind of managing the subjects of this larger social, kind of quasi-social community, because they themselves are not quite invested. It depends on the author, because there are authors who are willing to grant characters more to animals and so on and so forth. But at that level of kind of friendships and wars, I think there's the very instability of the extension of the political model is part of what is accounting for this moment that I'm thinking of. Conversely, it's not, one of the other questions we have to ask is how is the notion of the political being deformed or changed by the extension of the discourse of physis around it, so that a kind of political discourse in the 5th century is going to look really different from the Stoics, where, this whole notion of cosmopolitanism is, I think, an attempt to take sympatheia, which is a cosmic idea and a concept that's really being taken up with the world soul and all kinds of non-human natures, and to think, okay, what are its consequences for thinking the human world? And you come up with a totally different understanding of what a political community might look like than anything in Aristotle, anything anyone had come up with ever since. So I think that somehow recognizing the contiguity and sometimes the bleed between these discourses is really important to understanding what's going on around thinking. Having said that, again, like the notion of the kind of the consequences for the human political are they're not so interesting for me to the extent I'm more interested in sort of what is this kind of larger non-human community, and then what happens to humans within it. The second question about the kind of Latin Greek, I mean, the easy answer would be to say, as I pointed out at the beginning, why does Pliny say this, why does Cicero say this, what the Greeks call sympathy and antipathy, sympatheia, because, which points exactly what you were just talking about with physis and nomos. Why, this incredible plenitude of terms that translate sympatheia, and in fact mark the differences between domains that I've been saying we have to both recognize and bring together. And to me, that's partly evidence to say the project has to take into account the plurality of a lot of different things, because for the Greeks, sympatheia would hold it together. But your question is, does that persist into Latin, particularly if you have this kind of proliferation of words around it? And I think that part of, the way that you framed it in terms of natural law and what happens at the end of antiquity, part of my answer would be to having acknowledged that asymmetry, as it were. My answer would be similar to what I said a couple weeks ago, which is to say, well, actually, some of the story is not just a Greek and Latin story, but it's about different strands of ways of thinking this problem more generally, which would be to say, I don't talk very much about the language of what's katafusin and what's parafusin, and the ways in which that's operating almost independently of a concept of physis thought through the organism as a way of thinking the organism, being thought as a trans-individual principle. And one thing that really has struck me is it's not a parallelism, but for example, when we were reading the Timaeus in my seminar, I went through and looked at all the examples of physis, and there are like these ways in which physis is somewhat benign. It's just like the way something is. It's just, this is the way it should be, this is the way it shouldn't be. And I'm not saying, obviously, in Aristotle, there's going to be an intersection between what's katafusin and what's parafusin in the Hippocratics. I'm not saying there's no contact between these strands, but the adverbial way of thinking physis, so in the not nominal way, but the adverbial way of thinking about it as what's normative, what's not normative, particularly in the realm of custom. Is it normal for a man to act this way? It's often in sexual relations, has a kind of life of its own, I think. And one of the things that's striking is that when you look at, like Rainey Daston has an article about the fate of nature in the early modern period, and she's pointing in part to the kind of plurality of all of these different ways of thinking about nature. And she actually singles out this problem of natural law, and what's katafusin, what's parafusin, is the one that sort of is isolated from other changes around the way nature is being thought in physics and the organismic thinking and all the it's like has this kind of life of its own in moral authors and in legal texts that is both sometimes in contact with this other story that I'm telling and sometimes not in contact with it. So I think that there's actually, it's more a question of those adverbial usages and how they, because they're adverbial in the cases you're using, and that is almost an independent tradition, I think might not have anything to do with sympathy. It might at certain points, but it strikes me as kind of, that's one of the challenges of working with physis. There are like 66 examples of how you can use physis in the back of Lovejoy and Boas. They're not all going to fit under sympathy. I'll try.
Just by way, part of the reason I raised the question, just a comment, was because of the way you ended.
Yeah.
Right, with this sort of gesture towards ecology and so on. And I raised the example of something broadly speaking, like translation Latin Greek,
right,
by way of inviting reflection, not now and then later, about the kinds of cognitive, linguistic, and metaphorical acts we have to perform in thinking about the one body of material in theoretical relation to the 19th or 20th century or 21st century.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, no, point taken. Because I think like one of the challenges of saying, it's this both and, is that both and is a very difficult rhetorical position to take. And one of the things that I have found in my work, and it's something that's really important to me, is that there are reasons that stories get told in terms of absolute rupture and absolute continuity. You can see this, for example, in the history of what happened around the history of sexuality, for example. Either You have a total continuity. The Greeks are exactly like us. You know, you could see it in the feminist critique of metaphysics. Or, you know, you have the Tom Lacour story, or you have the Foucauldian story, where there's a total rupture, and then you have to understand everything in antiquity as the perfect inversion of everything that went before. And I think the investment in a rupture between Christianity and late Roman is important. This is something that governs the relationship between the pre-modern and the early modern. It governs, you know, the Romantics versus what came before. Rupture is, you know, is a powerful tool. And so with this notion of, you know, an untimely ecology, like, you know, I wanted to try to get, can we put a name to what it might mean to force ourselves to think both the really strange quality of ancient sympathy, because that's its association. It's association with this thing nobody believes in. You know, as I said in the first lecture, you know, Darren LaHoo thinks it's like the best example he can come up of like really weird science. That, like, how could we think our way into the world where people think that a magnet, if you rub it with garlic, will be antipathetic, you know, with the iron. I mean, this is totally wacky. And on the other hand, that it might actually be, I think it is, part of how this notion of a trans-individual nature, which has a long afterlife in Christianity because of what's going on in Galen. It's a merger between immanence and thinking about individual natures and demiurgic nature. I mean, that's what's going on, I think, in this trans-individual principle. So there's a reason it has a long afterlife. And I'm not saying the afterlife doesn't change in Kant, in Romanticism, at these other points, but that we have to think, we have to find ways of talking about the relationship to antiquity that is this both and. And we have to find ways of talking about it that are rhetorically powerful, because otherwise the really, really limited stories get told.
Yes?
I have a quick question on the novels thesis. And my question is, how do we distinguish between politics and sociability, and whether there is potential for sociability, not necessarily politics, in nature? For example, a Hegelian conception of Greek tragedy would be to say that the division between nomos and thesis is the fact that in antiquity we're only capable of grasping one aspect of the abstract morality, and it ceases to be the case when the immediacy by which we grasp the nature and human relations gave way to a mediated consciousness. And in modern ecology and sociology, there are people who argue that ecosystems or a continent could function itself as an organism, that maybe there is no intersubjectivity within the system, namely animals don't mediate their own consciousness by means of each other, but there is some kind of coherence, which we may call either political or pre-political in that sense. Do you think there is potential for this kind of innovative understanding of what constitutes a organic whole, maybe without very complicated mediated consciousness, but nevertheless is political in a natural sense?
So would you say that the political in a natural sense looks more like an organism?
Yes. And because we would say that in Creon and Antigone were thinking in political terms, but they were not thinking intersubjectively. So
right.
It would, in terms, it would be like they're not thinking socially or historically, but they were thinking politically. So I would say, my question is whether we can have this dividing line, maybe very murky, but does it exist that we can, by which distinction we can claim that some organic whole is political but not necessarily social?
Right. I mean, so I won't speak to the Antigone, but I think that for me, the question is, again, it's the instability that you see open up between, where you see this is what I've been trying to draw out between the idea of, okay, if the world is an organism, a zoon, and everything is just sort of integrated into the whole, and the parts are sort of for the purpose of the whole, and they all kind of breathe together. So one way of thinking about that is to somehow imagine that the parts are somehow realizing their truest natures and their lives within this larger whole. That would be a kind of, perfect synthesis. You might imagine that what seems like what you're talking about is where the lives of the individual don't really matter within the context of the larger whole. That might be another extreme. But the other problem would be, at what point does the the kind of seamlessness between the life of the whole and the individual good of the organisms within it break down. And that's what I think you're actually seeing starting to open up between this thinking of, well, what's a kind of capital N nature and what are the little natures within it. And I think it's a really hard question, because it's one that, with the example I gave a couple weeks ago about the leopards, like it's for their own good that they, find human excrement and eat it and therefore don't die. But for the humans who are trying to put out bait for the leopards, then you've got a problem because you were trying to trim the leopard population. And at that moment, transcendent nature is caught in Pliny's world between this supposedly providential, everything is for the sake of humans. That's what the sympathies and antipathies should be about, he says at the beginning of book 20. And yet, at this moment, the sympathies and the intuitive intelligence of these leopards that is somehow sanctioned by nature is about the life of the leopard. And so, this is a huge question, I think, for ecology and for, not just animal rights, but plants rights. How do we reconcile this idea that, no, it's all just the whole, and look, animals eat each other in the wild, and so therefore it doesn't really matter because we can't always think about the natures of the whole as autonomous. And, but on the other hand, there's, that seems like a really problematic perspective. You have to think about the integrity of natures in this kind of hard Aristotelian sense. And so I don't have the answer. But I think that what you're seeing in this operation of oikeiosis I was trying to pull out, which tries to think about how nature gives the animal a way to care for itself, to take responsibility for its own nature, is a kind of pulling away from this idea that an animal is just always part of a larger whole whose life it serves. There's a kind of tension there, even though I think if you push the Stoics, they say, well, it's like the point of the pig is to be eaten, And I mean, there's an academic critique of the argument about the pig that precisely says, if it's the benefit of, that ends up with this paradoxical conclusion that the benefit for the pig, realizing its own nature, is ending up as ham, which clearly is a problem. So that's all I could say, is that whether we call it, it's not whether we call it political or organismic, it's that the notion of the polis or the community as an organism puts a lot of pressure when your parts are wholes, and organismic wholes.
Hey.
This is a question about modes or models of sympathy that are negative or sinister. And here, of course, in Roman poetry. Since you said that you didn't talk about poetry, I missed last week, so I'm thinking maybe you didn't talk about it. So, in Lucan and in Seneca, there's the thought that everything coheres, and the world seems like either an organism or a machine, but that organism is either sinister or diseased or bad or discordant. Maybe it was always that way, and maybe it got that way. So I wonder if there's anything that you have come across in ancient Greek sources that would seem to tend in that direction. And there are a number of things that might resemble it but are not, right? I mean, like wanting to flee from the dregs of the physical isn't quite the same thing. Thinking that nature is brute isn't quite the same thing either. We find those things. But are there negative or sinister?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is actually the strand that I was trying to pull out with this idea of the vulnerability and the magnified vulnerability that sympathy marks within the context of the organism. That if the organism is diseased, if you have an integrated whole, if the parts aren't just like the army where in fact all the soldiers can die, but if you're the soldier who didn't die, great. It's not, the problem's not communicated to you, kata diados. I mean, that's the argument from Sextus Empiricus. The problem with an organism is this guy gets a cold and you've got a cold now too, that it's an interconnected world. And that the fascinating thing to me is that sympathy seems, because of the negative status of the pathos in both Latin and Greek, I think, is that, it's both connectedness, but it almost always has this kind of negative underside that, like, affectability itself has lots of dystopian potential. And so you see it not just in the medical text, but I think in the Stoics as well, and it points to you know, what I kind of glibly quoted, not glibly, because I think it's actually a deep connection between what Tim Morton talks about as deep ecology, which is a critique of the kind of Gaia hypothesis that we're all one and we're all united and et cetera, et cetera. Well, like, that's great until Chernobyl happens, or there's like a factory farm upstream from you, and then connectivity turns dystopian very quickly. And there are a lot, you know, we could think about, you know, I gave the example a couple of weeks ago, it's like, connectivity is great when, like, it's the, you know, Arab Spring and everyone's using social media to connect and overthrow, you know, the president. But it's very bad if you're, you know, Citizen 4. It's like the NSA, and they can get you anywhere, and they've got photos of you because the world is interconnected. You know, I mean, so interconnectivity. This is why I think we have to be very careful with this recuperation of sympathy, which is happening in some quarters, as this kind of mystic idea that we can all be connected with the non-human in one animate, breathing cosmos. I mean, that's a nice idea, and it's a true reading at some level of the utopianism of the world soul and the Timaeus and the way it gets read. But within this notion of organismic thinking in the medical tradition in particular, but you know, I think in other places where you're looking at the organism as a kind of micro level, the dystopianism comes out. And so I'd be interested to look at your sources, because I think maybe that's coming through.
Wow, I mean, that's so interesting, because you know, I might have thought that the kinds of examples that you were just talking about now are kind of like the Odyssey problem. The Odyssey.
Yeah, well, they could be.
You know, where it's like, oh, it's terrible that terrible things happen, but there's ultimately this. It's ultimately got to be good news at the end of the day, that there's a coherent structure. And Lucan and Seneca, you know, seem to hint that no, it's actually bad news from the get-go that it's like that. But what you say is very interesting, because it really points to the possibility that those pictures of sympathy, of nasty sympathy, of sinister sympathy, might be more philosophically rooted than they do often. So
yeah, and it's what level you're arrested at, because for the Stoics, it's like your cut finger, as it were, is recuperated at the level of the cosmos as a whole, you know. And I started with that Agnes Martin. I mean, everything is for the good. But at the level of the microcosm, or the level of the polis, any level that's not the cosmos in its totality, the potential for the dystopian side is absolutely there. And for you, what the Platonic moment would be, because see, for me, it's really an Aristotelian thing. That in Plato, phusis is not, you know, it's just not being used to think even the notion of the zoon at the cosmic level, as far as we can tell. It's not being thought of as a kind of integrity of the microcosm, but I mean, it's a kind of, you know, some people say phusis is replacing soul in the way soul functions as, you know, organizing a self-mover, et cetera, in Plato. But there's something, you know, that's particularly important about the idea of growth, and the idea that it's not just about moving towards a location externally, but moving, you know, and that might always be within phusis. I mean, again, I think this furling inward of the root, it's there somehow, but I think it's really in Aristotle where this notion of movement and dynamism is somehow within this immanent nature realizing itself, that it's somehow becoming itself in this kind of reflexive way. And the way that Aristotle forces you to think motion as both local motion and development towards, or maturation, seems to me really important to thinking of this kind of, what I'm talking about is kind of inward turning, this kind of inward orientation. So I'm taking it a little bit from the, I mean, I'm quite taken by some of the recent work, which I don't know in totality, but I'm just really loving reading this recent work on Aristotle's notion of the organism, which I think is giving more and more support for understanding this kind of inward turningness, this, you know, island notion, whatever it is, in terms that are sort of more persuasive than the knee-jerk reaction. I mean, it's a little bit unfair, okay, but like from some of the earlier work that says, no, you know, we don't want to go towards big N nature. We don't want to think about, you know, the nature, that isolating the kind of integrity of the nature is somehow, you know, saving Aristotle for, you know, from philosophy fiction. You know, there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction to defending that. And I think some of the more recent work sort of supports this idea of really thinking that notion of inward turning a little bit more systematically. So I don't know how much that, because I am sort of depending on some of this other work for that, but I find it very persuasive. And one of the things that French says, which I also find persuasive in Theophrastus, is that he says, you know, well, when you turn to plants, like their telos is like a little bit harder to determine, and they seem more, you know, as you turn outward, as you become interconnected, he says it's like the notion of nature, the notion of a physis as a nature becomes messier. And the notion of your end becomes more complicated when you see these kinds of, you know, the fig and the vine move together, but maybe they live on their own when they're not together. I mean, there's a way in which any moment you move outward, that kind of closed-inness becomes, I don't want to say undermined, but complicated. So I'm sort of trying to work through that kind of Theophrastic response to this Aristotelian organicism.
I'm curious about the value of life within the capital N nature and the these natures, specifically how might sympathy open possibilities for the non-living constituents of these natures, and if it doesn't, if sympathy relies on if sympathy and empathy rely on the conception of life in this way.
So, like, how bound are they?
Yeah, I mean, one of the examples is a shellfish affected by the moon, and I can see the sort of emphasis on the shellfish side. I'm curious about the moon side of the
yeah. No, that's a really good point, because it's like the moon at that point is a vehicle for the kind of active principle working on living things. And so the relationship is a little bit different, I think, than when you see the relationship between the shellfish and, say, you know, the pinna and the pinnagard or something like that. It's a little bit different. So there's something important, not just about, I think that the question of the animate and the inanimate would work out differently if we're thinking about the terrestrial world, so the stone versus the moon, which is a god, which could be animate. I mean, the cosmos is animate in all kinds of ways, but the notion of life is a bit different, because this idea of having to perpetuate a life, you know, that is mortal is sort of off the table. You know, one of the points that I tried to make in the first lecture is that sympathy itself, as it functions as an argument in Stoicism, should not guarantee that the cosmos is animate, the cosmos is sentient, or anything like that, because sympathy only proves the cohesion of a body. It's only, you know, and so the lowest level is the hexis of a stone. And to be fair, the Stoics don't try to prove that the cosmos is animate or intelligent through sympathy. And yet, what I was trying to argue was that there's a way in which sympathy is always already being thought through the organism because of the importance of the microorganism, the human body. I think medicine, I think, is just already there in their thinking of the organism at the level of the cosmos. And so Bernard Besnier, in his reading of Cicero's De Natura Deorum, actually makes this interesting observation that, like, there's a way in which the Stoics sort of, I mean, in the Cicero, sort of skips the level of proving hexis, you know, and just kind of moves to the level of organicism, you know, because that's kind of where it's at. And those moments, like in Diogenes, where he says, you know, physis is what holds the cosmos together, it's sort of like, well, that's not quite supposed to be what's happening. It's, you know, that's supposed to be hexis, and then you move to the level of physis, et cetera. So there's a way in which sort of physis point is another cue to, and the way that sympathy functions, you know, as in relation to organisms, are kind of cues that even though there is hexis and even though a stone can be cohesive, it really is about the organism. And I think that's true in Aristotle already. Elements are there, they have natures, you have to think them, you have to be able to give an account of nature that accepts that it's valid for elements. And yet it seems quite clear that the thinking about nature is really being done in the context of Zoa and Futa and all of the rest. So there's a kind of instability of that level. And of course there's you know, the sympathies and antipathies quadrant, which I haven't talked as much about, and the kind of overlap with learned magic. I mean, stones do have lives. Stones, you know, this whole distinction of making, you know, stones inanimate is going to, you know, Chris could say much more about this, but I mean, there are plenty of cases where stones wouldn't be sort of hived off from thinking about at least relationality lies. Maybe not the notion of the organism, but about loves and hates, and this language clusters around the notion of the magnet as well.
Thank you, Brooke, and please all join me in thanking Brooke for this excellent series of lectures.